Hello, it's me again, Brody McLeod. That fucking dickhead who wears ridiculous sunglasses in his YouTube videos that get about 10 views. But some people do watch them, so for the 8 people who might view this, you have my eternal respect and everlasting love and appreciation for your excellent use of content delivery platforms and your assailable adaptation to my wisdom and the rest of my intellectual capacity, which I try to sort of, within a vernacular of holistic healing and sort of vocational recovery, try to make sure gets coverage. So there's a word which isn't for children in the UK, and that word is cunt. You can't say cunt in front of children, but you can say it on YouTube. Some people, if you meet them, after about normally 20 minutes, 25 minutes, if you're especially normally in a pub environment, I find you'll come to the conclusion that somebody might just be a cunt, a total cunt, in fact. They might have maybe a Geo Joy t-shirt on, or maybe some Brill cream and a bit of Davidoff cool water. They'll be talking about sports and football and maybe have some Chinese tattoos that just basically say water or rivers are nice or whatever on them, but they think they're really cool. And, just generally people who, you know, aren't accountable for their actions. They hurt and sort of deride and torture others because they don't want to have to face accountability for their own revolting behaviour. And that behaviour normally is quite surmisable within, I find, if I see a total cunt, I can tell within about like half an hour. You don't really need to see them, speak to them, assess them. More than about half an hour, you can just mentally be like, do you know what? This person, man or woman, is just a total cunt and they're not worth talking to. And I don't want to ever speak to them ever again because they're a total cunt. Some people aren't though. Some people are really sound. And if you meet a sound person, it's really nice because you meet them and you talk to them and they're like, yeah, this guy's quite smart. This girl's pretty cool. She's not a total cunt. She's actually really sound. So you've got this kind of spectrum, where at one end, you got people who are basically feces, and at the other end, you got people that are just made out of solid gold. Lovely, lovely, jubbly people. And today, I'm going to focus on the people that aren't so lovely, jubbly. There's kind of like, I don't know what the opposite of an aphorism is. A denigration, effectively, without swallowing a thesaurus. I don't know, that, yeah, you can sort of denigrate somebody in various different ways. The situation that I've been in for the last few months, it's been quite dire, pretty awkward and awful things happening, and some proper total cunts who've I have to interact with on a daily basis. And that has triggered me quite a lot. It's really wound me up. It's made me, I haven't been violent towards anybody, but it's made me feel like I'd quite like to be. And I hate it. I hate testosterone. It's good for shagging, but it's not good for anything else really. No man ever achieved anything great while he was cursed and sort of coursing through his veins with testosterone. No one ever really did anything that was worthwhile. I don't think any man, other than impregnate a woman or stick your cock in her repeatedly, there isn't really anything that testosterone does for anybody. So I try not to let it control my life or make me do things which are not very sensible or destructive or, harm anybody, because that's not what you want. But there is a document here. I've taken sort of the ideology of an extreme insult, which sort of fits the bill for some of the people I've met in my life. And want to have a little deep dive into what those words mean, how they kind of should be contextually applied, and I guess give you a bit of a guide in case you meet a total cunt in the pub or in the park or at a nightclub or, going round to a mate's house for a smoke, you might just meet somebody and be like, that guy is a total cunt. Or a woman indeed. She also, it might be a total cunt, but she might be lovely as well. So look out for lovely people, because there is lovely people in the world and there's loads of them. And you can rely on them, and they're charitable and they're kind, they're friendly, they're forgiving, and they're normally quite intelligent. Total cunts, typically one of the first key indicators, if you are looking at a total cunt, is that they're probably vacuously unintelligent. They sort of, within the sort of vocational extrapolation of that sort of narcissistic lack of accountability, lies and a visceral and inertial ignorance that doesn't really go away. They kind of, normally people, what's the phrase, you know, the wise man knows himself to be a fool, but the fool thinks himself to be a wise man. It kind of manifests through viciously overconfident and kind of, yeah, sometimes degenerate kind of concepts and elements. Anyway, let's look at the research paper. So I don't know how long it's going to take me to read it, and I've already been talking at you for 6 minutes. So, etymological, morphological, and pragmatic analysis of the composite pejorative jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste, sex offender. That's what you might refer to someone at, as if they are a total cunt. So, introduction to the complete pejoratives and the phrasal aggression. In the study of pragmatic linguistics, sociolinguistics, and the mechanics of hostile discourse, the phenomenon of composite pejoratives represents an apex of verbal aggression. Unlike its singular incentives or traditional profanities, which rely on the semantic weight of an isolated lexical unit, composite pejoratives are constructed by strategically stacking adjective, adjectival, normal, and compound modifiers. This structural stacking is designed to deliver multi-layered, synergistic attack on the target's identity, morality, social standing, and existential value. The phrase jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste, sex offender serves as a profound, albeit profoundly hostile, and uniquely generative example of this aggressive linguistic architecture. So the specific formulation isn't a standard culturally codified idiom found in conventional directories. Rather, it's a bespoke, highly generative insult string engineered to maximize psychological and reputational impact. To fully comprehend the vernacular mechanics of the phrase, it is necessary to conduct an exhaustive etymological, lexicographical, and sociolinguistic breakdown of its constituent parts. Each element operates within a distinct domain of semantic denigration. For perceived class ascension and presumption, jumped up, moral and behavioural decay, that's degenerate, and existential and biological worthlessness, which would be what we might call a flesh waste. The ultimate societal taboo, coupled with legal criminality, which is people who are sex offenders. Repeat sex offenders sometimes, total cunts, sometimes they gang rape and repeatedly rape people and kind of children and stuff too. That does make you a total cunt if you gang rape a child, obviously. The combination of these terms creates a dense, like, illocutionary force that seeks not merely to insult the target, but to entirely invalidate their humanity and social viability through a detailed examination of the historical origins, morphological evolution, and modern socio-cultural applications of each individual term, alongside the construction of hypothetical pragmatic scenarios and structural paraphrasing. This report will elucidate the complex mechanics underlying this specific string of extreme implicatory vernacular. The analysis will traverse historical British slang, contemporary digital community gatekeeping, underground music aesthetics, and the rigid taxonomy structures of the modern legal system. So first of all, we've got the technical framework for composite hostility. So before dissecting the specific lexemes of the phrase, it's vital to establish the linguistic framework which such as an insult operates. So I'm not really reading very well. I'm taking loads of Valium today. In the realm of speech activity, theory even, as originally posted by J.L. Austin and further developed by John Searle. An utterance is not merely a transfer of information, it is the performance of an action. An insult carries an illocutionary force, the speaker's intent to demean, subordinate, or emotionally damage the recipient. Furthermore, it seeks specifically perlocutionary effect, the actual psychological wounding or social ostracization of the target. When a speaker relies on a single pejorative, for example, an idiot or a jerk or a fool, the illocutionary force is singular and easily categorized by the recipient. However, continuous exposure to standard pejoratives leads to a phenomenon known as semantic bleaching, wherein words lose their emotional and rhetorical impact over time due to overuse. The counteract semantic bleaching, speakers intuitively engage in morphological compounding and adjectival stacking. By combining disparate domains of insult, the speaker prevents the target from easily challenging and dismissing the utterance. So the string jumped up, denigrated, flesh waste, sex offender demonstrates this principle perfectly. It forces the cognitive processing of our four entirely separate vectors of attack simultaneously. So first of all, you've got the socio-hierarchical, so that's an attack on the target's presumed status. And you've got the ethico-moral, so an attack on the target's eventual internal character. Ontological, so an attack on the target's biological right to even exist. And then, of course, a criminological one, an attack on the target's relationship with legal and social boundaries. By bombarding the listener with these disparate vectors, the speaker overwhelms the recipient's defensive cognitive faculties, thereby maximising the intended percolationary effect. I hope I said that right. Lexicographical and etymological decomposition. The effect of a composite insult relies on the diverse angles of attack initiated by its individual lexemes. So the phrase is front-loaded with adjectives that modify the intensely derogatory compound noun, which itself acts as an attributive modifier to the final noun phrase. So jumped up, the linguistics of class transgression and arrogance. So the initial component of the phrase jumped up functions as a compound adjective rooted primarily in British English vernacular. Though its usage has proliferated across broader Anglophone dialects, etymologically the term describes an individual who behaves as though they possess a significant importance, authority or prestige, especially when such behaviour is perceived as unjustified due to their former lower socioeconomic or professional standing. From literal movement to metaphorical ascension. So to understand the metaphorical leap of jumped up, one must first examine the literal applications of the root verb jump. Historical archives demonstrate the literal spatial dynamic of the term. For instance, in an account from Kew, Stoke, Somerset, a narrative details how a man named Greenslade jumped up and bound him tightly hand and foot, referring to the sudden physical elevation from a sealed or grounded position to apprehend a bushranger. This sudden vertical movement is the kinetic foundation of the word. English idiom is replete with variations of this spatial action, encompassing physical, emotional, and institutional suddenness, such as jump for joy or jump in one's skin, jump ship to expectedly lead a post or party, and to jump the shark, which means to suddenly decline in quality. Additionally, derivations tied to sudden physical violence exist, such as the slang term for assault, getting jumped, and some sources loosely facing the Latin roots. When transitioned from the literal kinetic movement to social metaphor, jumped up takes on a deeply resentful hue. The historical and semantic core of jumped up is intrinsically linked to class structures and the conservative resentment of unwarranted social mobility. It is synonymous with demonstrating arrogance, conceit, and an inflated sense of self-worth. Lexicographical sources correlate the term with behaviours described as by idioms such as possessing airs and graces, or being too clever by half, or perhaps proud as Lucifer. Bit weird. In professional or institutional hierarchies, a common historical application is the phrase jumped up office boy, which derisively highlights a subject's lowly origins in contrast to their current authoritative posturing or pomposity. The term essentially serves to remind the target that their perceived true inferior place in a given hierarchy, functioning as a linguistic mechanism to enforce social boundaries by utilising synonyms such as swollen-headed, egomaniacal, or popinjay, that's a bit of a rare one. The speaker accuses the target of an artificial inflation of self. That's the sort of thing that lanky MP would probably say. The one he falls asleep, popinjay. I can hear him uttering that in my skull. Derogatory slang and ableist origins in British vernacular. So within the specific realms of British slang, the etymology of jumped up and its morphological cousins possess secondary, heavy derogatory associations that add profound layers of hostility. Some colloquial derivations trace the phrase to the rhyming slang Joe Hunt, which translates directly to the highly offensive profanity cunt. I did mention that at the beginning of the video. This links the term not only to arrogance, but to a profound vulgarity. Furthermore, versions of similar J words in British slang have historically been weaponised as general insults for fools or individuals with perceived learning or physical disabilities. Not what we want. A stark example of this is the cruel adoption of the name Joey, derived from Joey Deacon, a guest with cerebral palsy who appeared on the British television programme Blue Peter in the 1970s. Consequently, his name and associated J slang were currently adopted by school children as a derogatory and offensive insult for decades. Not something I was aware of in primary school, but that is pretty revolting, isn't it? Now, while the primary conscious meaning of jumped up remains centred on arrogance and unwanted presumption, these peripheral slang associations underscore the inherent cruelty and low register hostility embedded in the historical usage of such terminology. In contemporary digital subcultures such as tabletop role-playing games, forums, jumped up is frequently utilised to dismiss individuals who assume unwanted or intellectual or authoritative superiority over community norms. For instance, an individual dispensing unsolicited condescending advice on game mechanics or arguing over discrete flaming might be derisively labelled as a jumped up theory crafter. This application demonstrates the term's versatility in attacking not just class mobility, but any form of presumed intellectual or community elevation by a perceived non-entity. Now we get on to degenerate, and that's the vocabulary of moral and behavioural decay. The adjective degenerate introduces a profound element of moral judgment to the composite phrase, so shifting the attack from external social standing to internal moral failure. Etymologically, the word traces back to the Latin degeneratus, the past participle of degenerare, meaning to depart from one's own race or kind, derived from the prefix de meaning down and away, and the root genus meaning race or kind. Historically, the term was used primarily in biological and medical context to describe the physical or mental deterioration of an organism or a lineage. Over centuries, however, substantial semantic drift results in the term being overwhelmingly co-opted of a moral, ethical and socio-political denigration. To label an individual as a degenerate is to assume that they've fallen below the standard of normal human decency, morality or civilised behaviour. It carries connotations of debauchery, perversion and a fundamental corruption of character, gatekeeping and toxicity in digital ecosystems. So in modern internet vernacular, the term degenerate has experienced a massive resurgence, particularly with gaming and online community spaces, where it's often wielded to disparage individuals perceived to be engaging in socially unacceptable, toxic or perverse behaviours. In tabletop role-playing like Dungeons and Dragons, forums frequently witness the uses of degenerate to gatekeep acceptable styles of play. In these digital ecosystems, accusations of degenerate behaviour are frequently coupled with assumptions of perversion, condescension, and the ruined enjoyment of the collective. In these contexts, the word is utilised during instances of discrete flaming where players or dungeon masters attack the intent of other players. The usage of degenerate here is a mechanism of ostracisation, signalling that the target is not merely wrong regarding the rules, but fundamentally broken or polluted in their intent. When placed immediately after jumped up, the insult transitions rapidly from an attack on the target's unwarranted arrogance to a sweeping condemnation of their core moral fabric. The target thus framed simultaneously as a presumptuous and fundamentally polluted. Flesh waste, neologism and existential nihilism. The term flesh waste is the most obscure, visceral and morphologically fascinating compound of the phrase. It is a compound neologism, a blended portmanteau forged from the nouns flesh, denoting the physical, biological material of a human body, and waste, denouncing refuse, garbage, or something entirely devoid of utility or value. Unlike jumped up and degenerate, which possess centuries of documented etymological history, flesh waste is an emergent, hypermodern slang term. Its usage is exceedingly rare in standard lexicographical corpora, appearing predominantly in niche digital subcultures, underground music scenes, the darkest, most aggressive echelons of online discourse. There's a section on subculture origins and sonic aesthetics here. Notably, flesh waste is the recognised moniker of a musical identity associated with an album or track titled Stars of Landfill. Didn't know about this, which achieved minor recognition and rating visibility in underground music databases. The juxtaposition of the celestial aspirational word stars with the concept of a landfill perfectly mirrors the semantic payload of the word flesh waste itself, the deliberate reduction of human aspiration and biological complexity to literal garbage. The musical genre surrounding the term often led to abrasive, nihilistic or hardcore alternative aesthetics, where tracks might be described as sounding like aggressive pity, sex or adventure songs kicked up another notch, further highlight the gritty, visceral nature of the word. The lyrics of such bands are noted to seem simpler, relying on raw emotional conveyance rather than complex poetical structures, which perfectly aligns with the blunt, horrific imagery of human bodies conceptualized as mere waste. Linguistically, flesh waste functions as an existential insult. It entirely strips the target of their personhood, reducing them to a mere biological matter. It's not only useless but actively burdensome. It belongs to a specific paradigm of implicatory vernacular that includes phrases like oxygen thief, waste of skin, or biological refuse. By compounding flesh and waste, the speaker bypasses traditional moral or intellectual criticisms and attacks the very justification for the target's physical existence. The target is framed not as a moral agent who makes mistakes, but as an intimate, rotting pollutant occupying physical space on the earth. Sex offender, the final bit, the weaponization of ultimate social taboo. The final segment of the composite pejorative sex offender serves as the catastrophic rhetorical climax of the entire phrase. Unlike the preceding terms, which rely on subjective adjective descriptors of abstract existential insults, sex offender is rooted in rigid, unforgiving legal taxonomy. In a literal legal context, a sex offender is an individual formally convicted of a sexual crime, which can range from statutory offences and public indecency to severe violent crimes such as secondary degree rape. The legal apparatus surrounding this designation is uniquely stringent across Western jurisprudence. Registered sex offenders are subject to profound lifelong surveillance and restriction through mechanisms like the Sex Offender Registration Act. They must routinely register their whereabouts with local law enforcement, and even seemingly minor infractions such as failing to register a newly created social media account with the Sheriff's Department can result in immediate probation violations, the revocation of freedom and reincarceration. Clinical and forensic literature emphasises that treating such individuals requires a deep, intensive examination of deviant sexual arousal and behaviour to identify the cognitive behavioural antecedents of their offences. Furthermore, the legal standard is often unyielding. Strictability is occasionally applied to sex offender registration laws. In some highly controversial legal instances involving statutory context, even victims of rape by fraud have found themselves entangled in the strict liability parameters of sex offender statutes due to the rigid nature of the law. Court assessments routinely evaluate stranger risk factors and whether the offender has accepted responsibility, utilising DNA evidence to confirm the identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. Societal perception perfectly mirrors this legal severity. The designation of a sex offender represents the ultimate modern taboo, rendering the individual a permanent social pariah against whom strict liability is assumed. Therefore, when utilised as a component of a hyperbolic insult, especially against the individual who may not literally possess a criminal record, the term is weaponised to inflict maximum reputational and psychological damage. It causes the target of the most reviled form of predation known to contemporary society. The transition from flesh waste to sex offender creates a terminal semantic endpoint. The target's not only an arrogant, jumped up, morally decayed degenerate and exists useless flesh waste, but now they're also actively predatory and represent an innate, legally recognised danger to vulnerable members of society. So, yeah, the original insult was a jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste sex offender. So the syntactic synergy and morphological architecture. To fully appreciate the impact of this phrase, one must analyse it structurally. The architectural makeup of jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste sex offender demonstrates a sophisticated, albeit highly aggressive understanding of English syntax and adjectival stacking. Adjectival order and escalation. In standard English morphology, adjectives typically follow a specific order of predecessence, e.g. opinion, size, physical quality, shape, age, colour, origin, material, type or purpose. While pejorative strings do not strictly adhere to these formal rules, they follow a highly specific rhetorical rhythm designed to escalate tension and shock value. I won't leave that table, I can't be bothered. Phonological rhythm and aggression. So the phonetic rhythm of the phrase is deeply percussive and requires physical exertion from the speaker, mirroring the aggression of the sentiment. So the plosive opening, the hard plosives in jumped up and degenerate, require sharp exhalations of air, indicating anger or abruptness. Then you've got a fricative descent. These plosives gives the way to hissing fricatives and sibilants in flesh waste, sex offender. This phonetic transition requires the speaker to enunciate with increasing vitriol the physical tension, creating an auditory experience for the listener that perfectly mirrors the escalating severity of the semantic content. The compounding of these disparate domains of insult then ensures that even if the target is emotionally resilient against critiques of their professional or social status, they will inevitably be struck by the moral, existential or criminal accusations that follow. So contextual pragmatics and hypothetical scenarios of usage. Because this phrase is an amalgamation of extreme concepts, Its deployment is restricted to environments characterized by intense hostility, the total breakdown of social decorum, or specific linguistic subcultures that actively normalize hyperbolic verbal aggression. The following hypothetical scenarios elucidate the pragmatic context in which such terminology might be organically utilized. So here's a first scenario where somebody might be a total cunt, or in a more detailed version, an insult which adheres to this one. So you've got an asynchronous digital toxicity and TTRPG forums. Don't know what that means. So the modern internet, particularly competitive multiplayer gaming communities, anonymous image boards, and tabletop role-playing games, that's what that stands for, discourse forums, frequently fosters environments where verbal escalation is a primary code of conflict resolution. Due to the anonymity of the users and the low risk of physical retaliation, the linguistic often skews towards maximum hyperbole. In these spaces, gatekeeping is fierce, and accusations of inappropriate conduct are commonplace. Hypothetical application: user A, a community moderator or veteran player, is attempting to enforce standard behavioural rules in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. User B, a newer, highly confrontational player, repeatedly attempts to utilise game mechanics to enact sexually perverse or highly inappropriate scenarios within the game narrative. When confronted, user B argues condescendingly with the moderator, assuming perversion in others, claiming to be a superior strategist, and attempting to assert intellectual dominance over the established group. User A, entirely exhausted by user B's destructive and socially unacceptable behaviour, bans user B from the server, leaving a final, highly visible public message: I do not need some jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste sex offender attempting to lecture me on how to run this campaign. Your play style is abhorrent, your assumptions are sick, and your presence here is a liability. You are permanently banned. Pragmatic analysis. In this scenario, the insult is used to enforce community boundaries through verbal annihilation. Jumped up directly targets user B's unwarranted arrogance and suggests a status as non-entity, attempting to play the role of a theory crafter, degenerate, and a sex offender. Hyperbolically address the toxic, perverse nature of user B's in-depth actions, drawing a direct line between their fictional taboo-breaking and literal real-world criminality. Flesh waste serves as a brutal dismissal of user B's overall value to the digital community, rendering their arguments null and void. Then you've got scenario B. So, for example, you might have a high-stakes interpersonal conflict and a corporate escalation. So, in a physical space and professional environment, the deployment of this phrase would indicate a catastrophic collapse of a civil relationship and an intention to inflict profound emotional and professional trauma. This would likely occur during a highly volatile confrontation, explicitly involving accusations of severe real-world misconduct or systemic betrayal. Hypothetical application. So let's say, for example, two former business partners are engaged in an explosive dissolution of their corporate firm. Partner A discovers that partner B has not only been embezzling massive amounts of funds, acting with unearned entitlement and violating the fiduciary trust, but has also been leveraging their corporate positions to solicit deeply inappropriate, non-consensual relationships with significantly younger, vulnerable interns. A profound ethical and legal violation bordering on statutory crime. During the final boardroom confrontation where legal action is imminent, partner A confronts partner B. A partner shouts, "You walked into this firm with nothing and now you parade around with your airs and graces like a titan of industry. You're nothing but a jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste sex offender, and I'm handing these hard drives directly to the authorities to ensure you see the inside of a cell." Pragmatic analysis. So here, jumped up violently reminds partner B of their originally lower status, systematically dismantling their inflated corporate ego and punishing their pomposity once again. Degenerate attacks their catastrophical ethical failure. Flesh waste expresses partner A's absolute visceral disgust at partner B's biological presence. Most crucially, sex offender bridges the gap between hyperbolic insult to literal legal accusation, referring directly to the predatory behaviour towards the interns and invoking the severe strict liability nature of sexual misconduct law. Scenario C, literary, cinematic and dystopian world building. So in this hypothetical scenario, to give you some context, the authors and screenwriters frequently invent or deploy composite profanities to establish the tone, grit and aesthetic of a functional universe. In genres such as cyberpunk, grimdark fantasy or dystopian science fiction, characters often speak in a hardened, hyper-aggressive vernacular that reflects the bleakness and nihilism of their environment. So in this hypothetical application, in a dystopian cyberpunk novel, a protagonist, a hardened street-level detective, is interrogating a wealthy, corrupt corporate executive who operates an illegal underground human trafficking ring. Despite being handcuffed, the executive continues to speak to the detective with a haughty, condescending superiority, behaving as though their wealth grants them immunity to the law. The detective slams the executive against the interrogation room wall, leaning in close to snarl. You think your credits make you God down here in the landfill. You're just a jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste sex offender who got lucky with a trust fund. Out on the street, you're just meat waiting to rot. Pragmatic analysis. In this literary context, the phrase functions perfectly as a rapid world-building tool. It officiously establishes the executive's false arrogance, jumped up, moral bankruptcy, degenerate, and biological vulnerability. The term flesh waste brutally mirrors the cyberpunk theme of human beings being reduced to mere meat or landfill, a direct echo of the nihilistic underground music aesthetics from which the term likely derived. Finally, sex offender categorises the horrific nature of the trafficking ring. It immediately characterises the dialogue as gritty, adult-orientated and intensely confrontational. So now we've got a different section, a bit more sort of deep and contemplative, paraphrase syntax and implicatory vernacular. So given the extreme specificity and hostility of the target phrase, exploring paraphrase syntax requires mapping alternative vocabularies that achieve similar semantic goals across entirely different linguistic registers. The object is to replicate the four pillars of the insult: arrogance, presumption, moral decay, and biological worthlessness, and criminal predation. So using vernacular appropriate to various social strata, really. Register analysis and lexical substitution. So the selection of alternative technology depends heavily on the desired level of formality, the specific dialect being employed, and the setting of the discourse. There's a table I won't read. Scientific reconstructions and contextual paraphrasing. By utilising the lexical substitutions outlined in the table above, it is possible to construct paraphrase syntax that maintains the exact implicatory vernacular of the original phrase while adapting it for varied social contexts. Maybe let's have a quick look. So you've got, pretentious, arrogant, overtly entitled, swollen-headed, twisted, perverse, sick, unhinged and deviant, waste of space, oxygen thief, useless burden, creep, predator, abuser, or prick, popinjay, twisted freak, waste of skin, meat sack, piece of human garbage, and stuff like that. Anyway, that's what the table says. The high register legal clinical formulation. So if a speaker wished to convey the exact same level of profound contempt but was constrained by a need to sound highly educated, clinical or institutional, such as in a formal psychological evaluation or a legal brief, the syntax could be altered to sound detached yet utterly devastating. So a paraphrased phrase, a pathologically grandiose and morally bankrupt biological liability exhibiting the behavioural markers of a serial sexual predator. The implicatory vernacular, This formulation strategically removes the raw, unrefined emotional outburst of flesh waste and slang origins of jumped up, but retains the absolute character assassination. The phrase biological liability serves as the clinical equivalent to a flesh waste, implying through formal language that the target's physical existence is a mathematical detriment to the species. Pathologically grandiose perfectly captures the unearthed arrogance of jumped up, framing the subject's behaviour as a diagnosable mental defect rather than a mere social annoyance. Now, number 2 says British working class pub slang formulation. So, given that jumped up has deep historical origins in British slang, paraphrasing the phrase to fit purely British working class vernacular context results in a highly colloquial, aggressive string that relies on local idiom. So, paraphrased phrase, you might want to say instead an arrogant, twisted little oxygen thief and an absolute nonce. Implicatory vernacular, oxygen thief is the most direct British slang equivalent to flesh waste, implying that the target is actively stealing vital resources simply by continuing to breathe. Nonce is a highly severe British prison slang term for a sex offender carrying immense social weight, stigma and physical danger within the UK penal system. Arrogant, twisted, little effectively covers the semantic territory of both jumped up and degenerate, diminishing the target while simultaneously condemning their internal morals. Part 3, you've got the American internet and gaming culture formulation. So, adapting the phrase to the vernacular of modern American internet toxicity, where terms like degenerate are highly prevalent, requires leveraging contemptual digital slang and call-out culture terminology. So, phrased, an entitled degenerate waste of skin and a borderline predator. Implicatory vernacular. So, the word entitled has largely replicated jumped up in American internet parlance to describe someone possessing unearned arrogance or demanding unearned privileges. Waste of skin directly translates the visceral body unit on an element found in flesh waste. Borderline predator captures the grave accusation of being a sex offender without explicitly involving a formal legal conviction. This is a common tactic in online call-out culture, where the accusations of predatory behaviour are frequent and utilised to socially exile members from communities. Then you've got, actually quite interestingly, a Shakespearean archaic formulation for illustrative purposes regarding the timelessness of composite insults and morphological stacking. Translating the phrase into archaic or early modern English demonstrates how these 4 pillars of insult, status, morality, biology and crime, have always existed in the human linguistic repertoire. So, paraphrased phrase might be a presumptuous popinjay, a derived lump of foul deformity and a ravager of virtue. Implicatory vernacular, popinjay, a conceited, vain or overly talkative person, is directly synonymous with the historical use of jumped up, depraved in the historical equivalent of degenerate, lump of foul deformity, in brackets a phase borrowed from Shakespeare's Richard III, serves as the perfect historical parallel to the modern neologism flesh waste, effectively reducing the human body to useless, ugly, burdensome matter. Finally, ravager of virtue captures the predatory criminality of a modern sex offender with the linguistic constraints of the era. The dynamic between semantic bleaching and semantic intensification. So, when analysing the paraphrase syntax, it's vital to acknowledge the socio-linguistic forces of semantic bleaching versus semantic intensification. As previously established, semantic bleaching occurs when a word's meaning is weakened through overuse. For example, degenerate, once a powerful biological or absolute moral descriptor, has been somewhat bleached in the internet culture to simply mean someone who plays a tabletop game in a weird or annoying way. However, the phrase jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste sex offender deliberately circumvents this bleaching progress through semantic intensification by placing a highly rigid, unbleached legal term sex offender at the absolute end of the phrase. The speaker retroactively re-intensifies the preceding adjective, so the listener can't assume that degenerate is being used playfully or casually when it's immediately followed by a literal accusation of sexual criminality. The legal, constitutional and societal gravity of the final noun phrase anchors the entire insult in absolute undeniable severity. Furthermore, the inclusion of the obscure visceral neologism flesh waste shocks the listener, preventing them from glossing over the insult as standard bleached profanity. Because the term is incredibly rare, it forces listeners' brain to process the literal concept of wasted flesh and the imagery of stars of landfill, thereby maintaining the shock value of the utterance. The speaker successfully hijacks the listener's cognitive processing, ensuring maximum perlocutionary damage. So then you've got the broader socio-linguistic implications of lexical compounding. So the exhaustive analysis of this specific composite phrase reveals several broader insights into how English speakers manufacture hostility and police social boundaries. Firstly, it underscores the persistent, unshakable relevance of class and social hierarchy in modern insult formulation. Despite the purported egalitarian ideals of modern Western society, the linguistic impulse to attack someone's perceived unearned elevation, the jumped up dynamic, remains a primary instinctual response when initiating verbal combat. Whether this concept is applied to an arrogant office boy overstepping his bounds or a presumptuous theory crafter demanding authority in a digital forum, punishing presumption is almost always the function upon which the rest of a complex insult is built. Secondarily, the creation and integration of words like flesh waste highlights the incredible morphological creativity driven by human anger. When standard codified insults like idiot, fool or jerk fail to convey the necessary depth or contempt or nihilism, speakers intuitively utilize compounding to forge new words. By combining core biological noun with a noun denoting refuse, the speaker creates an image that bypasses higher order logic and appeals directly to primal disgust, echoing the darkest sentiments of underground subconscious. Finally, the weaponization of the taxonomic term sex offender illustrates how clinical and legal terminology is eventually absorbed into the public vernacular as a mechanism of ultimate social execution. In earlier historical areas, the ultimate linguistic taboo might have been a religious destination, for example, a heretic, blasphemer, or a witch. In contemporary secular society, where strict liability applies to sexual offences and the protection of the vulnerable is considered a paramount civil duty, the sexual predator represents the ultimate, unforgivable societal demon. Accusing someone of this crime, especially within a string of other severe pejoratives, is the modern linguistic equivalent of verbal excommunication and total destruction. So in conclusion, the phrase jumped up, degenerate, flesh waste, sex offender functions as a masterclass in the linguistics of total denigration. It's a highly engineered composite pejorative that systematically dismantles the target across four distinct axes: social presumption, moral integrity, biological utility, and also societal safety. Etymologically and morphologically, it acts as a bridge spanning centuries of linguistic evolution. It pulls jumped up from historical British class and anxiety's literal physicist movement and cruel slang. It drags degenerate from its ancient Latin roots of biological decay into the realm of modern behavioural critique and digital gatekeeping. It forges flesh waste from the dark, nihilistic corners of modern musical subcultures. Finally, it crowns the construction with sex offender, the most devastating legal and social label available in the contemporary era. Through an analysis of the hypothetical scenarios, it's evident that such a phrase is exclusively reserved for environments of extreme escalation, be it the toxic anonymity of digital forums, high-stakes interpersonal corporate portrayals, or gritty narrative fiction. The exploration of paraphrased syntax demonstrates that while the specific lexemes can be altered to fit entirely different linguistic registers, from clinical academia to street-level slang, the underlying semantic intent remains consistent to comprehensively identify the target as an arrogant, morally bankrupt entity whose very physical existence is an offence to the civilized world. Ultimately, the phrase serves as a profound example of how human beings can instinctively manipulate the structural rules of language, combining adjectives, neologisms, and legal taxonomy, not merely to communicate displeasure, but to construct a weaponized narrative designed to achieve the total linguistic and social annihilation of the subject. So, whether you are a lovely person or a total cunt or a degenerative flesh waste sex offender, at least you know where you stand now. And I hope you've enjoyed watching my video, and I hope I get at least 5 or 6 views. Thanks very much.